I will burn this system to the ground if I have to. These men aren't just criminals. They are predators.
That was Nancy Mace almost a week ago now, dropping a bombshell on the floor of the U.S. House. Here we are, though, Sunday in South Carolina. We're getting you connected to the Capitol. That happened in a different capital, the nation's capital, but it will have an impact here in South Carolina, what the Low-Country Congresswoman had to say last Monday night in the U.S. House, making some very bold claims against her ex-fiancé and 3 associates of the ex-fiancé, who SLED does confirm is under investigation. For what? We're not quite sure, because that is not part of the discussion right now from SLED. But Dave Wilson is here, Catherine Glenn Foster is here to talk about this situation. There were some serious things said.
Very serious.
In the U.S. House. Nearly a 60-minute speech. She was given the opportunity to talk about abuse against women. Serious subjects that maybe some people aren't taking seriously enough. Why choose that venue, Dave, to do it on the U.S. House floor?
I think one of the reasons is when you are on the U.S. House floor, as a member of the U.S. House, you have the ability to actually have immunity from whatever it is that you say. She has an open forum. They can say anything. There's no ability for you to have any lawsuit against for defamation, slander, anything along that line. It is part of the immunity that members have when they are in that position. And so by doing so, she was able to basically have an entire open national forum. That could be a good thing for Nancy Mace if she wants to help people to understand what it is to be a victim, to be able to talk about it from that standpoint. But there is a political flip side to this as well. The question about whether or not she's running for governor, does that play into the decisions that she made? Does that play into what goes on with the fact that she's calling out Alan Wilson, who is also a potential run for governor, calling him out on the floor of the U.S. House as well?
For not pursuing the evidence she claims that he knows about in these cases.
And yet there's one small part of this, is the fact that to be able to do that, all of that has to happen on the floor of the U.S. House. Unfortunately, I think for her, she published this information out to certain folks within the media and folks beyond the media, but she also posted the picture that she claims of the predators on her social media, apparently, more than an hour before she gave the speech, which then takes that level of immunity off. So there is a potential with the words that she said, especially with people who are not currently under SLED investigation, there's some potential of defamation suits there.
Sure. And to get everyone up to speed, I think everyone probably knows some about this. This is about thousands and thousands of files, videos, photos that she says were found on her ex-fiance's devices of women in various states of undress, sexual acts, potentially drugged, unknowingly being photographed. That's what this is about. She says the Attorney General knows about this. He says, look, this is not the case. This is blatantly false. You had an opportunity to bring this to our attention. You have not. Still, the nature of what she's saying, this is serious business from a legal standpoint for a lot of reasons, particularly for the 4 people named.
Absolutely. And so what she is claiming, what she claimed on the House floor, is that she was looking through her fiance's cell phone. He had handed it to her, and she runs across photos and videos of women in states of undress and various acts. It appeared that they were not doing so willingly, and as she flips through, she sees herself.
Yeah.
So imagine that moment. Imagine that moment where you're flipping through these photos and you see yourself in a situation that you had no idea you were in. So SLED is still investigating. They've been investigating for quite some time
December
now.
December 20th of 23.
Yes, more than a year now, and we expect that this investigation will continue. We trust that SLED will get to the bottom of this. But in the meantime, we can just appreciate for writ large what she is doing here, because there will be no justice unless all of us speak out and share our story, our truth, unless we have the whistleblowers who are brave enough to go out there and explain what's happened to them and expose wrongdoers. So while we don't know the truth yet in this situation, we can still applaud the process and trust that we will get to the bottom of what actually took place and what evidence was found on that phone.
Yeah.
And that's the place where you have to look at this. And in the American system, you're guilty until proven, you're innocent until you feel guilty.
You almost
until
got it
proven
backwards.
innocent. Yeah, you're innocent until proven guilty. And yet there seemed to be, from what she is putting out there, a lot of evidence of something. She didn't go into some very specific details. Sometimes she did. It was a 53-minute speech on a Monday night. And this is a place where she, as a member of Congress, has the privilege to be able to go to the House floor and to make these sorts of statements and put it in the national record. And that is something that she did. It will have implications. It is not just about the allegations and the potential crimes that took place, the victimhood of everything. It also plays directly into South Carolina politics in 2026 in the gubernatorial race. And we've always said South Carolina is, there's politics and there's South Carolina politics, and South Carolina politics is more like a blood sport. I mean, it is the worst of rivalries sometimes. Think about your high school rivalry there at home. You know, it is Clemson, Carolina times 100 when you talk about South Carolina politics. And that is exactly what we're also seeing playing at the same time. And it makes the whole conversation, I think, difficult because there's so many people who go, well, why did you do it? Why did you do it now? It needed to be done from her perspective. But there's always that question that runs in the back of people's minds going, is this part of a ploy? And you don't want that to countermand what she was actually trying to do and to say these sorts of actions are wrong.
Right, and so we're going to be heading into the gubernatorial race at the same time as we see most likely multiple lawsuits coming out of this, potentially charges brought against these men, but also potentially civil lawsuits, both from the victims and defamation suits against Nancy Mace and potentially others.
I think the bottom line takeaway from this is that these accusations have to be taken deadly seriously because there are victims out there and they need to know that they have a voice and that there are people out there that can help them.
Amen to that.
Yeah, absolutely. To get us back to our State House now, under our State House dome, something we've been talking about for weeks now, energy in South Carolina, the demand for it, improving the power grid. The House did that in this past week, at least took steps to go in that direction. They call it the South Carolina Energy Security Act, cutting red tape, making it easier to fast track projects because our population is booming, businesses are coming here, the demand is great.
We have more than 5 million people in South Carolina. We have increased our population by more than 1 million in the last 15 to 17 years. We're expecting another 1 million in the next 15 to 17 years. That's a lot of people. When you pair that with the businesses that have come into South Carolina, you think all the way back to BMW coming in 1991, to Boeing, to Volvo, you think about the high-tech companies like Google, Amazon, Walmart, all of those are coming in here. And that's high energy demand. And so we've got to be able to meet that demand. And so what the House has done now is they've been able to say, okay, we'll allow fast tracking of things like what needs to be done for natural gas, what needs to be done for other forms of energy. And at the same time, it has left open the question, and it's going to get tossed over to the Senate now. What do we do with VC Summer and the nuclear reactors that we're still paying for and will be paying for long after this show? So,
and many shows to come.
Yeah, exactly.
That's for certain.
Exactly. So now heading over to the Senate, we're going to be looking very closely towards Senators Davis and Clymer and watching them to see how they're going to lead on this issue. There will be a lot more to come in the future weeks.
Yes, and the governor himself, we have a statement from him about them passing that. You know, energy need was a big part of his State of the State address.
It was.
If we recall. He did post a statement applauding the House for what they did, passing that energy bill. It says today, but that was just a few days ago that this happened. And said, and like you said, looking forward to what the Senate now does. He wants them to send something to his desk. He's going to sign it. And again, pointing to economic development and the state's population.
And you really can't, you cannot look at economic development and without having an answer to some of these questions.
It has to be done.
And if something's done with VC Summer, because keep in mind, VC Summer is a project between Santee Cooper and what was then SCE&G or SCANA. That company is now part of Dominion. And so the question is, what are they going to do with these 2 nuclear reactors that were once half built, once a quarter built? And if they actually then turn around and take private investment, which is one of the solutions that Senator Davis from Beaufort County has said, listen, we've got people who want to bid into and become part of this. Then South Carolina, with 3 nuclear reactors in Fairfield County, becomes a massive power exporter to other states across the region. And that really is a huge thing that could be a positive step and a positive thing for the people of South Carolina, knowing we've got enough power generation, but also knowing that that power generation can be bringing income back into the state.
Because it needs to happen, because there was a lot of money paid up front by all of us who were power customers during the formation of that half-done project, if it's even half-done. I haven't walked the grounds myself, so I wouldn't know.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. It has been a while. That has been one of the big talking points that we have addressed in the last few weeks. And another one, too, is the death penalty here in South Carolina. It is the law. That is a fact. We have had 3 executions now in this state since the process was rebooted back in September. We are due for another one about a month from now. The next inmate set to be executed, Brad Sigmund, convicted of killing his girlfriend's parents, beating them to death with a bat more than 20 years ago. As we continue to talk about this, there were some questions about some of the cases beforehand, particularly the last one, Marion Bowman, who was put to death just a few weeks ago. There were real questions about guilt or innocence in that case. You were there that day.
Yes. And we have a guest with us.
We do.
Yeah,
We
so
do.
I'd like to go ahead and bring her in here. Reverend Hillary Taylor. She is the Executive Director of South Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, who led the vigil. But I was there that day. Dave was there as well, and we were able to be part of that vigil and really observe what was going on. And it was a powerful experience. Reverend Taylor, can you just share a little bit about the death penalty in South Carolina?
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share. So South Carolina has 31 people who were on death row. SCDC says it's 29, but according to Justice 360, which represents people on death row, it's 31. We've executed 46 people since 1976, which is when the death penalty was reinstituted as a constitutional form of punishment. And we also have 3 methods of execution here in South Carolina. We have lethal injection, we have the firing squad, and we have the electric chair.
That's right. Now, as Brian said, there have been 3 men executed since September, since that 13-year moratorium ended. For 2 of those men, Freddie Owens and Marion Bowman, there were serious questions about their innocence, questions that were never fully explored and certainly not in court. For the 3rd man, for Richard Moore, there were extenuating circumstances where he had gotten himself into some drug use. He walked into that convenience store intending to rob it, but he didn't have a weapon and ended up killing someone, but in self-defense was the argument that was made. Can you share a little bit more about those 3 men and what took place there?
Yeah, so, and I will also say that Richard Moore actually did not intend to go into the store to rob it. He was a few cents short of purchasing something and he got into an argument. And it was the clerk who actually pulled out guns. And Richard Moore, of course, grabbed one and they got into a fight and they shot each other. What these cases show is that the death penalty is arbitrary. It shows that the death penalty really isn't used for the worst of the worst. It's used for people or against people who have poor legal representation. It's exclusively, almost exclusively used against people who are impoverished or come from working class backgrounds. You'll notice that Alec Murdaugh or Todd Kohlhepp, right, 2 of some of the biggest names as far as serial killers go in this last decade or the last 15 years, they were never considered for a death sentence. The death penalty is also given disproportionately to people who come from historically marginalized backgrounds here in the United States. It's given to people who cannot represent themselves in a court of law well, so people who have intellectual disabilities, people who have persistent mental health issues. The death penalty, again, is targeting people who are already targeted or already disproportionately in our criminal legal system, in our prison system.
Thank you for that. Now, in just a few short weeks, we have a 4th execution scheduled, and that's for Brad Sigmund. He is not one of those people for whom he has an innocence claim, but what can you tell us about his journey and his life there on death row?
Absolutely. So what we often see with people who are on death row is that many of them also come from places where they were traumatized or they became victims of somebody else's violence long before they committed violence against other people. And that's Brad's story. Brad comes from a pretty traumatized childhood background. His father abused him. His mother neglected him. At an early age, as a teenager, Brad actually took shifts so that he could continue to support his family, dropped out of school in order to do that. He was identified as a loving and tender older brother, but also somebody, because of his childhood trauma, who experienced some persistent mental health issues, undiagnosed and not dealt with. And so in his early 30s, those persistent mental health issues manifested, and he committed the crime that he has been accused of. Brad is not somebody who denies that. He's somebody who's remorseful, extremely remorseful. And if he could work towards the restoration of the people that he has harmed, he would do so. But we do not have a system that allows for that to happen. We don't have a system that emphasizes restorative justice. And so what Brad has done is he has worked every day on death row to do the work of sorry in the ways that he has been able to. He is somebody who's a devout Christian. He's somebody who provides emotional and spiritual care to people on death row as well as people who are off of death row. And there are people, his family, but also the people that he has been connected to off of death row that have said he has been somebody who is loving and kind, and they don't know what they would do without his presence in their life. He is somebody who could be described as an informal chaplain, again, on death row. He's also somebody that if he were to be executed would be the oldest person executed in South Carolina's history. He's 67, he's in poor health. He is somebody that actually I think would be really good at helping us solve the problem of violence, especially in our prison systems. And what I can tell you is that executing him will not make us safer. Executing people using the death penalty does nothing to deter violence, to deter crime. In fact, states that uphold the death penalty actually have larger rates of violence than states that don't execute anybody, including deaths of police who are in action. I find that that's a really interesting comorbid statistic, that people, or that states that have the death penalty have more police deaths in action.
I want to ask you a question too. You get to know the families of some of these death row inmates. It has to be, and likely families of victims too, as you investigate these cases. I have to imagine that's a difficult balancing act, maintaining the fight for justice and the emotional aspect of all of this.
Absolutely. One metaphor that I like to use is a metaphor of a chaplain. I'm somebody who has extensive experience in hospital chaplaincy in addition to being a United Methodist pastor. Now, when you're in the trauma bay, or at least the trauma bay that I have worked in most closely, sometimes you'll see on one side of the trauma bay somebody who has been driving under the influence and now they're being checked out by the doctors and nurses in the hospital. And on the other side of the trauma bay, divided by a very thin curtain, is somebody who was hit by that driver who was driving under the influence. And doctors are doing different work, but very important work to try and make sure that this person can stay alive, to make sure that they're okay, and if they're not okay, to try and keep them alive at least until their loved ones can come and tell them goodbye. And my job, or the job of any chaplain in a hospital, is not to pick sides, it's not to judge, it's not to, give, the same kinds of care necessarily to these people. But it is to say that both of these patients need help. Both of them need spiritual and emotional support. What can I do for each of these people and the different needs that they have?
Reverend Taylor, I think one of the things that we listen to the work that you do with South Carolinians for alternatives to the death penalty. There are folks who are out there who don't fully understand what you're attempting to do. Quite often, it is the work in trying to get clemency for folks, which is basically getting them off of the death row part of their sentence to remain in prison. It's not a pardon, but you have vigils, you do the work that's out there. What impact do those vigils have in the community, and what impact do those have on you?
Yeah, they have a huge impact on our community. So typically we have about 35 to 45 people who have been showing up to vigils outside of Broad River Correctional Institution. These are very somber experiences. You have people who are holding signs, you have people who go by, who see our signs about how there's an execution today, and those people are honking in support of us. Something that I've noticed is that there are no people who are protesting our vigil against the death penalty. There are no pro-death penalty protesters. And it's a really emotional moment because not only are we killing somebody intentionally, using the powers of the state and using our taxpayer dollars, but we also are acknowledging the people who have been lost in this entire case. We're acknowledging the loss of the victims and how there's nothing that can be done to truly help people heal from that loss. One thing about SCADP, my organization, is that we actually have murder victim family members who join with us and do speaking events, sometimes along death row survivors or people who used to be on death row who were resentenced to alternative prison terms and are now returning citizens, now people who are outside of prison. And so one of the things that we are very clear about is we are not here to oppose the experiences of victims. Victims get to feel however they want to feel about the loss of their loved ones. All victims deserve to be seen and heard and have their pain taken seriously, and to know what happened to them will never happen to them again. And the death penalty is the poorest way to help people move through that pain and that grief and that loss, and to reassure them of their safety. For me personally, I hold all of these things, right? I gave you this metaphor of somebody who's been harmed, somebody who has done harm. And what this metaphor helps me to know is that sometimes there's a very thin line, a very thin curtain between the identities of these two people, of these two groups of people. And so this is a really important moment for us to bear witness at these vigils to the wrongness of the situation, the fact that the death penalty is not a foolproof system. For every 8 executions in the United States, 1 person is exonerated. If we had airplane crash rates like that, we would not fly planes.
Sure.
To put it very, very simply. We don't even risk, human health with bad lettuce, right, in the grocery store. So why we're willing to do this with human lives is really something. And I am definitely personally impacted by this as somebody who holds all of these stories, who knows with a lot of depth the pain and the sorrow that all parties connected to these cases experience, because I've heard them, because I've heard the stories, and I've helped people hold those stories so that they can tell them to other places. And what I'm also really moved by is the compassion of the people who are at these vigils who also hold these stories and who also want to make sure that we solve the problem of violence in South Carolina. There are creative ways that I don't think we are looking into here in this state, including asking people who have committed atrocious, awful acts of violence and who have done the work of I'm sorry, and who have done the work of trying to restore, trying to help people find healing and stability in the aftermath of that. Helping those people to help us craft solutions to actually address the problem of murder and violence in South Carolina. And so part of my job is to not just abolish the death penalty, but to catalyze criminal justice reform in this place. And I hope that other South Carolinians will help me to imagine what we can do to make our South Carolina a safer place, and a place that really encourages human flourishing, and a place where people do not experience the scarcity that would lead them to commit atrocious, awful acts of violence, or to experience them for themselves.
Powerful words, for
powerful.
sure.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Reverend Hillary Taylor, South Carolinians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. I'm sure we'll be hearing from you in the weeks to come as we lead up to the next scheduled execution in this day. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to finish this week with justice, in fact, in the subject of courtrooms and the judges that head these courtrooms and how they're selected in the state of South Carolina. We talked about this a week ago. The selection process, mainly done by lawmakers who also, in many cases, tend to be attorneys who could then argue cases in front of the very same judges that they appoint. We're looking at one case in particular this week, a judge from York County who seemed to have all the qualifications. You brought this to my attention just the other day. If we could just show her picture real quick, Marcus, if we could. Melissa Inzerillo. On paper, looks like an ideal candidate for a judgeship. It didn't happen.
And more than on paper.
Yeah.
In fact, she was almost universally recommended with either qualified or highly qualified on every single category that she's evaluated on. The vast majority of the testimony, the people who wrote in on her behalf were in favor of her. And yet she was not selected despite being unopposed. She was the only candidate for this seat. And
that's the rub of this one, that there was no one on the opposite side.
It's not like she lost to somebody. She lost to zero. She lost to null. And that there's a level of injustice seeming when you have legislators who turn around and have a qualified candidate and then they vote for none, which is basically what they did. I think the other side of this is, why are we going through this process to end up with a person who has spent her life's career as a public defender? She understands what the arguments are. She's been doing this, and sometimes there were some folks who came out and said, well, I don't know if she's going to be impartial to a defense or to a prosecution. And yet she's been doing this for a long time. And how you have members of the legislature, some of whom just turned around and said, well, you can try again next time. Exactly.
And they would rather have an empty bench than have and create more of a backlog of cases.
Which we already have.
So let's make that worse instead of putting a highly qualified candidate in that seat. One thing that was interesting was that the Freedom Caucus came out, they didn't have to say anything, but they came out and they said, well, we're not sure that she'll be fair and impartial to the police officers. No evidence to support that other than perhaps the fact that she's a public defender. And yet we don't seem to have those same questions when a prosecutor is running to be a judge. So there's a lot going on here, and it starts to raise real questions about the entire system and how, as I think it was Matthew Hall, he put it, it seems to be perhaps pretty broken.
You could say that. Yeah. And that is why we've been talking about the Merit Selection Committee for quite some time now about how we do this. So to put this for the sports fans watching, this is like, it's here in basketball season. It's like the women's basketball team showing up, the other team doesn't show up, but they still somehow lose.
Right, exactly.
I mean, come on.
And there's no game.
And there's no game. There's no game.
There's no game.
But she had to go through the entire process. It's not like she didn't go through the training. She hasn't done all the things that got her to the big game. But it's also like turning around and saying, okay, as the referees, we're going to call everything against you.
Even though you're not playing.
Even though you're not playing.
Foul.
All the calls, all the fouls, technical fouls and everything, there are no free throws in this one because all of those got thrown away. And that's a part of this where you sit here and go, to Catherine's point, it's not like we don't have a backlog of cases in circuit court in South Carolina, and to leave the 16th Circuit seat empty. So cases in Rock Hill and York County, in Chesterfield County, and that area just stack up. And that's the part of inefficiency in government that, we really got to start dealing with right here. And it's a political process. And that's the part that we want you to understand as a viewer, because when you sit here and listen to all this stuff, you go, what does it mean to me? It means this. You may have somebody in your community who is facing a court charge, maybe facing a crime that they have been accused of. How long do they have to sit? How long does that have to wait? How long until justice can actually have a chance to actually be had. And so that is a real important part of how this process works and why it's important for you.
Yeah. We packed a lot into this week.
We did.
On this Sunday here in South Carolina. We got you connected to the Capitol and everything else that we could possibly think of this week, and we're going to do it again 7 days from now. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Dave. Reverend Hillary Taylor as well for her commentary today. But we'll see you next week.